Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. With a groan, Pat rolled over and squinted at the glowing numbers on her phone screen. 5:30 a.m. Another day was beginning. Sitting up slowly, Pat ran a hand through her tousled hair, feeling the silky strands between her fingers. It had grown longer over the past few months, now brushing her shoulders. A small smile tugged at her lips as she remembered how short it used to be, back when she still presented as male. Swinging her legs over the side of the bed, Pat stretched and yawned. Her cat, Whiskers, meowed insistently from the foot of the bed, demanding breakfast. I know, Pat murmured, her voice still rough with sleep. Just give me a minute. She padded to the bathroom, flicking on the harsh fluorescent light. The face that stared back at her from the mirror was a work in progress. Softer than it had been a year ago, but still not quite where she wanted it to be. Pat leaned in close, examining her jawline and running a finger along the slight stubble that had appeared overnight. With a sigh, she reached for her razor and shaving cream. The routine was familiar by now, almost meditative. As she carefully removed the unwanted hair, Pat allowed her mind to wander, thinking about the day ahead. Work at the store would be busy, as always. There was that new shipment coming in that needed to be unpacked and shelved, and her manager, Steve, had mentioned something about a staff meeting. Pat grimaced slightly at the thought. Steve wasn't exactly the most understanding when it came to her transition. Finishing up her shave, Pat patted her face dry and reached for her hormone medication. The small pills nestled in her palm, a daily reminder of the journey she was on. She swallowed them with a gulp of water, then began the process of applying her makeup. Foundation first, to even out her skin tone and soften the lingering shadow of facial hair. Then a touch of blush to add some color to her cheeks, eyeliner and mascara to accentuate her eyes, and finally a swipe of pale pink lipstick. Pat studied her reflection critically. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. She was getting better at this, more confident in her technique, and more importantly, she was starting to see herself in the mirror rather than a stranger. A loud meow from the kitchen reminded her of her neglected feline companion. "Coming, Whiskers!" she called out, giving her reflection one last glance before heading to feed her impatient cat. In the kitchen, Whiskers wound around her ankles, nearly tripping her as she made her way to the cupboard where the cat food was stored. "You're going to be the death of me one day," Pat chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind the cat's ears before pouring kibble into his bowl. As Whiskers munched happily, Pat set about making her own breakfast. She popped 2 slices of bread into the toaster and started the coffee maker, inhaling deeply as the rich aroma began to fill the small kitchen. While waiting for her toast, Pat glanced at the calendar hanging on the fridge. The date of her next appointment with the gender clinic was circled in red. It was still a few weeks away, but she felt a flutter of excitement every time she saw it. Another step forward in her journey. The toaster dinged, startling her out of her reverie. Pat buttered her toast and poured herself a cup of coffee, then sat down at the small kitchen table. As she ate, she scrolled through her phone, checking her emails and social media. There was a message from her parents asking if she was still coming over for dinner that evening. Pat typed out a quick reply confirming that she would be there. Her relationship with her parents had been strained when she first came out, but they were trying. It wasn't always easy, but it was getting better. Finishing her breakfast, Pat glanced at the time and realized she needed to get moving if she didn't want to be late for work. She quickly rinsed her dishes and put them in the sink, then hurried to her bedroom to get dressed. Opening her closet, Pat surveyed her options. She settled on a pair of black, skinny jeans and a flowy blue blouse. The outfit was comfortable enough for work, but still made her feel feminine. She slipped on a pair of flats. Heels were still a bit too ambitious for a full day on her feet at the store. Pat gave herself one last once-over in the full-length mirror on her closet door. The person looking back at her wasn't quite who she'd always imagined she'd be, but she was getting closer every day. It was a journey, she reminded herself, one step at a time. Grabbing her purse and keys, Pat gave Whiskers a final pat on the head. "Be good while I'm gone," she told the cat, who merely blinked at her in response. The morning air was crisp as Pat stepped outside, a hint of autumn in the breeze. She took a deep breath, savoring the fresh scent, before setting off towards the bus stop. The walk was short, just a few blocks, but it gave her time to mentally prepare for the day ahead. At the bus stop, Pat nodded a greeting to Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in her building and often took the same bus. Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly in return. She had been one of the few neighbors who hadn't batted an eye when Pat had started transitioning, treating her with the same kindness she always had. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Johnson said. "Off to work?" "Yes, ma'am," Pat replied. "Another day, another dollar, right?" Mrs. Johnson chuckled. "That's the spirit. Oh, here comes our chariot now." The bus rumbled to a stop in front of them, and Pat helped Mrs. Johnson up the steps before finding a seat for herself. As the bus wound its way through the city streets, Pat gazed out the window, watching the world wake up around her. Shops were opening their doors, early morning joggers pounded the pavements, and cars filled the roads as people began their daily commutes. It was a scene Pat had witnessed countless times, but somehow it felt different now. She was part of it in a new way, living her truth in a world that was slowly, sometimes grudgingly, making space for her. The bus came to a stop a block away from the store where Pat worked. She bid goodbye to Mrs. Johnson and made her way down the aisle, careful not to bump into anyone with her purse. As she stepped off the bus, she took another deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Time to face another day. The store was already bustling when Pat arrived, even though it was still 10 minutes before opening time. She pushed through the staff entrance, nodding hello to her co-workers as she made her way to the break room to stow her purse and clock in. "Morning, Pat," called out Jasmine, one of the cashiers. "Steve's on the warpath this morning. Fair warning." Pat groaned internally. "Thanks for the heads up. Any idea why?" Jasmine shrugged. "Something about inventory numbers not matching up. You know how he gets." Indeed, Pat did know. Steve had a tendency to fly off the handle at the slightest provocation, and inventory discrepancies were one of his pet peeves. She made a mental note to double-check all her work today, just to be on the safe side. After clocking in, Pat headed out to the sales floor. She was assigned to the home goods section today, which meant a lot of heavy lifting as she restocked shelves and arranged displays. It wasn't her favorite part of the job, but she tackled it with determination. As she was struggling with a particularly unwieldy box of pots and pans, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Need a hand with that?" Pat turned to see Mike, one of the stock boys, grinning at her. Mike had been one of the first people at work to fully embrace her transition, never missing a beat when she'd asked everyone to start using she, her pronouns. "That would be great, thanks," Pat said, gratefully stepping aside to let Mike take the heavier end of the box. Together, they managed to get the box up onto the shelf. Pat wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, silently cursing the fact that she'd have to touch up her makeup before facing customers. "So, how's it going?" Mike asked as they started unpacking the box. "Any word on when you're officially changing your name?" Pat smiled. The legal process of changing her name from Patrick to Pamela had been a long and frustrating one, but she was finally nearing the end. "Actually, yes, I've got a court date set for next month. If all goes well, I'll legally be Pam by Christmas." "That's awesome," Mike exclaimed, giving her a high five. "We should celebrate or something." "Let's not jinx it," Pat laughed. "But thanks, it feels good to be making progress." They chatted amiably as they worked, discussing everything from the latest office gossip to Mike's plans for college next year. It was moments like these that made the job bearable, Pat thought. The camaraderie with her co-workers, the sense of normalcy it brought to her life. As the morning wore on, the store grew busier. Pat found herself constantly on the move, helping customers find what they needed, restocking shelves, and tidying displays. It was tiring work, but she found a certain satisfaction in it, especially when she was able to help a customer find exactly what they were looking for. Around noon, Steve's voice crackled over the intercom, calling all staff to a meeting in the break room. Pat exchanged a wary glance with Mike before they made their way to the back of the store. The break room was cramped with all the staff squeezed in. Pat found herself wedged between Jasmine and the vending machine, trying not to bump into anyone as Steve cleared his throat to begin speaking.
"All right, listen up,"
Steve began, his face set in its usual scowl. "We've got a problem with our inventory. Things aren't adding up, and I want to know why." He went on to detail the discrepancies, his voice growing louder and more agitated with each sentence. Pat tried to focus, but she found her attention wandering. She was acutely aware of the sweat dampening her blouse under her arms, and she hoped it wasn't visible. The last thing she needed was for Steve to call her out for looking unprofessional.
"Oh. And if I find out anyone's been slacking off, or God forbid stealing, there'll be hell to pay," Steve was saying when Pat tuned back in. "Got it." There was a mumbled chorus of "Yes, sir," from the assembled staff. Steve nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Now get back to work, and remember, inventory check at closing time. I want everyone on their A game."
As the staff filed out of the break room, Pat caught Jasmine's eye. "Well, that was intense," she murmured. Jasmine rolled her eyes. "Tell me about it. Sometimes I think he just likes the sound of his own voice." Pat stifled a laugh as they made their way back to the sales floor. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of customer interactions and restocking shelves. By the time her lunch break rolled around, Pat was more than ready for a breather. She headed to the break room, retrieving her packed lunch from the fridge. As she sat down to eat her sandwich, she pulled out her phone to check her messages. There was a text from her mom confirming dinner plans for that evening. Pat felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety at the thought. Dinners with her parents were still a bit of a minefield, but they were trying, and that counted for something. As she was finishing up her lunch, Mike poked his head into the break room.
"Hey, Pat, there's a customer out here asking for you specifically. Says you helped her last week, and she wants your advice again."
Pat blinked in surprise. It wasn't often that customers asked for her by name.
"Okay, I'll be right there,"
she said, quickly gathering up her lunch debris and tossing it in the trash. She followed Mike out to the sales floor, where an older woman was waiting near the kitchenware section. As soon as she saw Pat, the woman's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, there you are," the woman exclaimed. "I'm so glad you're working today. You were so helpful last time. I just knew I had to come back and ask for your advice again." Pat felt a warm glow of pride. "I'm happy to help," she said, smiling. "What can I assist you with today?" The woman launched into an explanation about wanting to surprise her daughter with some new baking equipment, and Pat listened attentively, offering suggestions and leading her around the store to show her different options. It was moments like these that made her job feel worthwhile, the ability to make a positive difference in someone's day, no matter how small. After helping the woman make her selections and ringing up her purchases, Pat returned to her regular duties. The afternoon seemed to fly by, a constant stream of customers and tasks keeping her busy until it was nearly closing time. As the last customers were ushered out and the doors were locked, Steve's voice came over the intercom again, reminding everyone about the inventory check. Pat sighed, resigning herself to a late night. She caught Mike's eye across the store, and he gave her a commiserating grimace. The inventory check was tedious work, requiring each employee to count and record every item in their assigned section. Pat found her mind wandering as she tallied up pots and pans, her thoughts drifting to the dinner with her parents later that evening. She hoped it would go smoothly, but there was always that undercurrent of tension, the unspoken words and careful navigation of sensitive topics. It was past 9 by the time Steve finally declared the inventory check complete. Pat's feet were aching, and her back was sore from bending and stretching to reach items on high shelves. She was more than ready to head home. As she retrieved her purse from her locker, Jasmine approached her. "Hey, a bunch of us are going to grab a drink at O'Malley's. Want to join?" Pat was tempted. It had been a while since she'd socialized with her coworkers outside of work, but the thought of her waiting cat and the need to prepare for dinner with her parents won out. "Thanks, but I can't tonight. Maybe next time?" Jasmine nodded understandingly. "No worries. Have a good night, Payday." The night air was cool on Pat's skin as she left the store, a welcome relief after the stuffiness of the break room. She checked her phone as she walked to the bus stop, seeing a missed call from her mom. With a sigh, she hit the callback button. "Hey, Mom," she said when her mother answered. "Sorry I missed your call. Work ran late."
"Oh, that's all right, dear,"
her mother replied, her voice carrying a hint of tension that Pat had become all too familiar with over the past year. "I just wanted to make sure you were still coming for dinner tomorrow." "Yes, I'll be there," Pat assured her. "Around 6, right?"
"That's right, and,
Her mother paused, and Pat could almost hear her internal struggle. "Your father and I were wondering, will you be dressing, as Patrick, or—" Pat felt a familiar pang in her chest. It had been over a year since she'd come out to her parents, and they still struggled with accepting her true identity. "Mom," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I'll be dressing as myself, as Pam, because that's who I am." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Of course, dear. We'll see you tomorrow." As Pat hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of frustration and sadness wash over her. She knew her parents were trying in their own way, but moments like these were a stark reminder of how far they still had to go. The bus ride home seemed longer than usual, Pat's mind churning with thoughts of work, her parents, and the constant balancing act that was her life. By the time she reached her apartment, she was emotionally drained. Whiskers greeted her at the door with an indignant meow, clearly unimpressed with her late return. I know, Pat murmured, bending down to scratch behind the cat's ears.
"I'm sorry I'm late. Let's get you some dinner."
After feeding Whiskers and changing into more comfortable clothes, Pat flopped onto her couch, feeling the weight of the day settle onto her shoulders. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of quiet. The sound of her phone buzzing jolted her out of her reverie. It was a text from her friend Sarah, checking in to see how she was doing. Pat smiled, grateful for the friend who had stood by her side throughout her transition. She typed out a quick reply, giving a brief rundown of her day and mentioning the upcoming dinner with her parents. Sarah's response was immediate and supportive, offering encouragement and reminding Pat of how far she'd come. Feeling a bit more positive, Pat decided to treat herself to a relaxing bath before bed. She ran the water, adding a generous amount of lavender-scented bubble bath. As she sank into the warm water, she felt some of the tension begin to leave her body. Closing her eyes, Pat allowed her mind to wander. She thought about the progress she'd made in her transition, the small victories and the ongoing challenges. She thought about her job at the store, the co-workers who had become friends, and even the difficult customers who had, inadvertently, helped her grow stronger. She thought about her parents and the complicated mix of love and frustration she felt towards them. They were trying, she reminded herself. It wasn't easy for them either. But oh, how she wished they could just see her, truly see her as the woman she was. As the water began to cool, Pat reluctantly got out of the bath and dried off. She applied her nightly moisturizer, taking care with each step of her skincare routine. It was a small act of self-care, a way of honoring the body that was slowly but surely aligning with her true self. Dressed in her favorite pajamas, a soft pink set that made her feel feminine and comfortable, Pat settled into bed with a book. Whiskers jumped up to join her, curling into a purring ball at her side. As she read, Pat found her thoughts drifting to the future. The upcoming court date to legally change her name, the continuing hormone treatments, the possibility of further surgeries down the line. It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path. With a yawn, Pat set her book aside and turned off the light. In the darkness, she whispered a quiet affirmation to herself, something her therapist had suggested she do each night. I am Pam. I am strong. I am becoming who I was always meant to be. As she drifted off to sleep, Pat felt a sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready to face them. Thanks for watching. Check out Patreon if you want to have early access to the other parts. If not, it will be online in a couple of days.